Japan and South Korea are two of the most successful and stable democracies in East Asia, an impressive achievement in a region that has seen democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism. Both countries have created prosperous societies and developed innovative economies. Japan is the third largest economy in the world, and South Korea is the 12th in the world. In East Asia, only China's economy is larger than either country. They are neighbors connected not only geographically but also by broad cultural ties, complementary political structures, and a shared commitment to international institutions. Both are critical allies of the US, and yet relations between Japan and Korea are falling apart.
あの戦争には何ら関わりない私たちの親孫、その先の世代、未来の子供たちが
상황에 무엇보다 중요한 것은
The 7th Fleet area of concentration is shifted from Korea to include other points of American interest along the 2,000-mile coastline of eastern Asia. From Korea and Japan in the north, training exercises and patrol go on to maintain the high standard of readiness required of a force of warship.
Japan and the Republic of Korea have been central to the shared alliance system that provided stability to East Asia for decades. During the Cold War, the US forged bilateral alliances within each country, forming the so-called hub-and-spoke system. This alliance system helped prevent another war on the Korean peninsula, avoid a recurrence of civil war between China and Taiwan, and contain the Soviet threat. The relationship between Japan and the Republic of Korea, along with their alliance with the US, will likely be critical to East Asia's future as it undergoes major ongoing shifts. Since the end of the Cold War, East Asia has remained divided, and if anything, the threat of instability has grown.
They have mostly the same goals in mind in terms of perceived security threats, which is definitely not each other. So for example, North Korea, number one, China, Russia, also shared threats like weapons proliferation, chemical weapons, terrorism, things like that.
Despite diplomatic efforts led by all US administrations, North Korea continues to advance its nuclear program.
And then, by no means least, North Korea's future looms over these differences. I see no reason to believe or conclude that Kim Jong-un stands ready to move toward an outcome that South Korea, Japan, the United States, or indeed China should deem an acceptable long-term outcome with respect to its missile nuclear development.
Korea and Japan are surrounded by three nuclear strategically independent, powers.
To the west, China presents another more complex challenge. China's rapid growth has provided an economic opportunity for Japan and South Korea.
For much of South Korea's early development, Japan assumed a dominant role, but that has diminished significantly over time. China was almost a non-existent factor in South Korea's trade in the late 80s. Today it represents 20% or more.
Korea and Japan is in a position to keep so-called liberal international order led by the United States.
So we also see, though, in this context, as both at different times Japan and South Korea have faced economic retaliation from China for policies that Beijing objected to. For example, 2012 heightened maritime tensions with Japan, leading to, for a time, a cutoff of rare earth exports to Japan and other kinds of tensions and retaliatory measures. In 2017, we saw heated Chinese objections to US ballistic missile defense deployments, leading to cutting off of much tourism, reducing Korea's imports, and punishing major Korean companies like Lotte, basically Lotte withdrawing from China.
While Japan and the Republic of Korea are not bound by formal security treaty, their alignment is critical. The turbulent modern history between these two nations can be traced back to the early 20th century, when Japan established Korea as a protectorate.
All the other issues are fine, except historical issues.
The governments in both capitals, Seoul and Tokyo, believe history problem is important. but where they stand are very divergent.
This initial arrangement, where Japan promised to take measures for guidance, protection, and control, quickly turned into a colonization of the Korean peninsula from 1910 until August 1945. Japan's colonization entered an especially harsh phase as Japanese militarism and imperial expansion in Asia accelerated from the 1930s onward. Japanese authorities pushed aggressively for cultural assimilation, including requiring their subjects to adopt Japanese language names. The Japanese government also mobilized young women throughout the Japanese Empire who were forced into so-called comfort stations or brothels. The majority of these women, known euphemistically as comfort women, were Korean, but some were from China, Taiwan, the Philippines, and other colonized regions. The total number of women forced into sexual servitude, while disputed, is often estimated at 200,000. Koreans were also mobilized into unpaid or underpaid labor during the war. Estimates by historians range from between 700,000 to 1.5 million people. After Japan's defeat in World War II, occupation of Korea ended, but Korea's hopes for independence fell victim to a struggle between competing powers, leading to the division of Korea and the outbreak of a bloody civil war. In South Korea, the civilian government became increasingly dictatorial in the 1950s as President Ri engineered his continued hold on power. A brief democratic interlude in 1960 to 1961 ended in the 1961 military coup by Park Chung-hee, a former officer in the Japanese military. To shore up South Korea's position against its northern enemy, President Park sought to improve ties despite widespread anti-Japanese sentiment. With strong encouragement from the US, Japan and South Korea took the first step to reconcile their troubling past. In 1965, the two governments signed an agreement that normalized their relations. Despite apprehensions, the Korean government, facing great pressure from the US, signed. Relations between the countries improved after the agreement, but the climate changed as South Korea democratized during the 1980s and 1990s. As the political environment opened, groups within Korea began to demand amends for the suffering that Koreans had experienced under the occupation. Victims began to organize and to raise awareness through public testimonies and lawsuits. For the first time, the stories of Korean comfort women, which had been concealed by the Japanese military and government, were broadcast on an international scale. In 1991, as part of a collective lawsuit in Japanese courts against the Japanese government, Kim Hak-soon gave the first ever public testimony about her experiences of sexual slavery, paving the way for many more to follow.
This is a very meaningful day for the Korean people.
South Korea's admittance to the United Nations in 1991 provided the victims and activists a powerful forum to educate the international community and to pressure Japan to confront atrocities committed during occupation. In 1993, Japan released a statement regarding the comfort women entitled the Kono Statement. The statement apologized and acknowledged that the Japanese government and military, at times, administrative and military personnel directly took part in the recruitments that severely injured the honor and dignity of many women. 2 years later, Prime Minister Murayama followed with an apology to the victims. A Japanese public-private partnership was also established in 1995 entitled the Asian Women's Fund for Comfort Women that collected private donations for the victims. The salutary effect of these apologies and actions on Japan-Republic of Korea relations, however, has been fleeting. In an effort to resolve the lingering conflict surrounding reparations for the comfort women once and for all, former South Korean President Park Geun-hye and former Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo reached an agreement in 2015. The Japanese government promised 1 billion yen, about $9.9 million, from the Japanese government to directly support the surviving Korean comfort women. Prime Minister Abe and President Park also agreed to a military intelligence sharing agreement in 2016.
It has, of course, the ungainly name, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, or GSOMIA.
The agreement, strongly supported by the US as well, was a milestone in military cooperation, allowing the countries to share sensitive information on North Korea, whose actions were growing more bellicose. These plans to improve relations, however, were short-lived. Just a year later, the Comfort Women Agreement had unraveled due to strong opposition in Korea in the election of a new president, Moon Jae-in.
Japan-Korea relations has always been the weak link in the alliance structure, in the U.S. alliance structure in Northeast Asia. But it really began spiraling into a deterioration cycle last summer.
In 2018, the Korea Supreme Court ruled in favor of claimants seeking restitution for their forced labor under Japanese occupation.
Those rulings from the Supreme Court in South Korea ordered Japanese firms based in Korea to compensate wartime laborers or forced laborers.
To pay for this compensation, a district court has ordered the liquidation of Nippon Steel's assets in Korea.
Exactly a year has passed, but Japan continues to claim reparation matters were settled through a 1965 accord aimed at normalizing relations between the two sides. What started as a thorny historical dispute soon expanded to trade and security.
In July 2019, the Japanese government announced that it would begin restricting the export of specialized chemicals used to make semiconductors to Korean companies. 1 month later, Japan removed Korea from its trade whitelist of approved and safe trading partners. The move effectively requires additional procedures that slow down the acquisition of vital products.
This move was approved to revise Japan's export controls appropriately and was not intended to hurt Japan-South Korea relations or to craft countermeasures.
South Korea is now challenging this policy in the World Trade Organization. Military cooperation is also breaking down. In August 2019, South Korea announced its intention to withdraw from the GSOMA, which would effectively end the sharing of sensitive information about North Korea, but ultimately backed down amid U.S. pressure. The escalating tensions have even led to a military altercation. Japan claimed that a South Korean Navy vessel locked its radar for firing weapons at a Japanese patrol aircraft off the coast of the Noto Peninsula in 2018. The Republic of Korea denies this and blames a Japanese aircraft for swooping dangerously close to its naval vessel. Reflecting the deteriorating relations, Japan and South Korea are engaged in a public diplomacy battle.
In other news, Japan is not happy about the possibility of South Korea being allowed to join a proposed expanded G7 summit.
These government-to-government breakdowns have larger implications, especially for the U.S., Japan, South Korea alliance system that is facing an increasingly challenging environment. The deteriorating Japan-Republic of Korea relationship is weakening alliance cohesion, just at a time that it is needed more than ever. The only question that remains unanswered is what can be done to improve the situation.
I think we have a very inward-oriented and nationalistic civil society in both Korea and Japan. And in Japan, the right-wingers raise too much voices about the Korea-related issue and then say that they don't like Korea. In Korea, we have a very left-wing oriented civil society who are very nationalistic, who always raise the flag of anti-Japanism. So these two voices in civil societies are overrepresented in mass media, and then governments listen to them. So the government officials and political leaders are also preoccupied with the voices of all the noisy nationalistic, inward-oriented voices.
I still believe that the foundation at the society level is rather good, and of course we are all human beings, so we have mixed feelings. But the biggest obstacle, as I hinted in my previous intervention, I think has to do with the relationship between the government administrations in both capitals. I think ideologically and otherwise, they are on the opposite ends of the spectrums in a way, so to speak.
Sort of a righteousness in both Seoul and Tokyo, and trying to move away from this stance. I might call it a legalistic perspective, including civil society in the process, but a settlement type of negotiation, moving away from a legalistic stance, sort of a black and white stance, I think would be the way forward.
The general perception that political leaders are too much preoccupied with their own, the civil society's opinion too much, and then follow the public rather than lead. So I think politicians should lead and then persuade the public that we have a much more shared interest in a strategic context and the larger context.
First of all, just expressing clearly to both countries that it's in the interests of the United States and also of those countries themselves to have better relations would be the beginning of that. Having a more honest dialogue about how past history can be addressed in constructive ways, and that all countries have aspects of their history that they have to come to terms with is a kind of a second step in that.
その上で日韓首脳の電話会談昨日行われましたが、そこでは両首脳は日韓、日米間の連携の重要性、これを改めて確認をした上で、菅総理から旧朝鮮半島出身労働者問題をはじめ、現在非常に厳しい状況にある日韓関係をこのまま放置してはならないと考える旨述べるとともにですね、韓国側において日韓関係を健全な関係に戻していくきっかけを作るべきとの我が国の一貫した立場を明確に伝えたところであります。